Hello, and welcome to your very first content lecture in my LBST Art and Culture class. I hope you have all watched the Guns, Germs, and Steel movie and understand why some places civilization progressed a little bit faster than in other places. It has everything to do with geography. And the most special location for the development of cultures rapidly was the Fertile Crescent, as Jared Diamond pointed out. So, we're going to start our study in the Fertile Crescent, specifically in Mesopotamia. And that's the area right over here. The name Mesopotamia means land between two rivers. And the two rivers in Mesopotamia are the Tigris and Euphrates. The other part of the Fertile Crescent is, of course, the Nile River in Egypt, and we will be looking at that in the next module. So stay tuned, we'll get there. And these cultures are happening simultaneously. We're looking at them sequentially, but just keep in mind always that the way we see them is not reflective of the timeline. So here we are. And we're going to look at several cultures that lived in this area. And then at the very end, we're going to look at a culture that grew and grew very strong over here in Persia, the Persian Empire. But we're going to start just in Mesopotamia. Notice by looking at the map that, like I said, there are two rivers there. So there's a source of good fresh water, but it's also pretty open. It's not defensible. There's not a mountain range surrounding it. There's very little coastline. So, in other words, it's kind of open and it's going to get invaded several times because it's such desirable real estate. But we're going to start by looking at the oldest culture on record here, and record is one that they made. So, our oldest culture is Sumer. And Sumerians actually are historic. They developed writing, and this is the form of their writing. It's cuneiform writing. On the right is a very nice photograph of a clay tablet that has been written in, and the little cartoon on the left shows the manner of writing. So, a stylus, a sharp stick, could be pressed into wet clay either by a point or an edge, and you can see the variety of marks in the clay, all made by the same tool. These started off being little pictograms, little pictures of things like houses and sheep, things like that. And then they became more and more abbreviated into just these symbols, similar to the way that the Chinese language started off, the written language started off as little drawings and evolved. So, this is very important. This puts Sumer in the classification of a historical culture. They wrote down mostly records of their grains and storage and inventories, things like that, business things. But they also recorded some literature, some tales, the names of their deities. And so we have quite a bit of knowledge of the Sumerians thanks to their writing. Here are two clay tablets with cuneiform writing that are in the UNCC library. As of this morning, the library is closed to users, but I'm hoping that before too long it may be open again and you would be able to walk in there and see the exhibits that are in the back of the main floor. So in addition to these clay tablets, they have several Egyptian pieces, and they will be in my slideshows on Egyptian art as well. So I think it's very special that these things are on campus. So I sincerely hope you all have an opportunity to see them in person. So what else about Sumer? Well, I think most of you know that civilization occurred when people no longer had to hunt and gather, and that they could stay in one place and grow crops and have domesticated animals. And this happened in Sumer. So they built permanent cities, And then it appears that in this culture also there was a priestly class that evolved. So originally, the Sumerian people had been sort of all one big hodgepodge group culture. And then a group of men had decided that they could speak as intermediaries between people and the gods. And so that means that they designated themselves as priests. And that's the literal definition of a priest is an intermediary. So um, this priestly class evolves. The priestly class then determines that they need to build a temple to the gods. And defining the gods, the most obvious starting point is the sun, that the people all over the world worship the sun because, in their understanding, this glowing orb that traveled across the sky each and every day could be nothing other than a deity. And it was up. So the priests, when they wanted to reach the deities, had to put their temple up above the ground. So they built these structures called ziggurats, and this is a reconstruction of one. And it's sometimes pyramidal looking tiers, but it's really essentially a man made mountain or a very large platform on the top of which is the temple where a statue of a deity would be placed and people would bring their petitions and their offerings to the deity. And the priest would work in that temple, receive those offerings, and that was their living. They would live on that. So this is sort of a mythical or an ideal reconstruction. I think it's supposed to be the White Temple, but I'm not real sure. Here's the way it looks today. This is why we look at a reconstruction. Ziggurats were just made of mud brick, and that is exactly what it sounds like. It's just hard, dried mud. It's not baked. So 5,000 years of sitting out in the desert wind and occasional rain would cause this to happen. It doesn't really look much like a ziggurat anymore. But that's the oldest one. So look at the date of that. It's about 3000 BCE, which is 5,000 years ago. So that's what we're talking about with Sumerian culture, is that old. And here's just another more beautiful photograph of that same ziggurat, same mound. And here's a diagram, a plan showing the organization of it. So you can see it's not symmetrical. And over here are the ramps and stairs that lead up to the platform on top. And this is the temple. So there's always a temple. The ziggurat is never just a standalone pile of dirt. So the temple in this case, look at it, and there's a number 1 in there in the middle, and very close to the number 1 is this little blob all by itself. That probably represents the position of the statue of the deity, because it would be sort of the focal point of the temple after all. And then there are several side chambers that were undoubtedly used for storage of the offerings that people brought. And as you know, this is an agricultural area, so the offering probably brought often enough would be grains. And that also is what the priests lived on. They would consume it, and I'm sure they could exchange it in the marketplace for other things. So here's another drawing of that very same ziggurat, the white temple on the ziggurat at Uruk, modern day Warka. Now here's a bonus feature, and you'll see that as we go through my lectures that lots of times I will add pictures of things that are associated with the culture or something we've just talked about that I find interesting, and I think you might too. And this is a cone mosaic. The ziggurats in the temples were not left plain. They were not just plain mud walls, but the Sumerian people wanted to decorate them, and so they devised this way of patterning little pieces of different colors of clay and creating patterns like on the column on the right, these little triangles. And that's just simply for pure visual delight, that they served no function, they just made the place look a little fancier. You probably saw in the movie too that they like to plaster their interior walls. And again, that was just to make them neater, prettier, cleaner, and then it gives them a better surface to paint on as well if they choose. Now, the bringing of offerings was the primary form of worship in a lot of these cultures, that they believed the gods existed and would give them good things in exchange for good things. So if you wanted something from a god, you had to bring them something that was valuable, something of value, and in exchange you would hope that the god might hear your request and give you what you're asking. So this was found in a temple or near a temple of a ziggurat dedicated to the goddess Inanna. And sometimes it's referred to as the Inanna vase. She was the goddess of love and war, and in Mesopotamia, eventually this goddess will change her name and become Ishtar. And she has counterparts in other cultures as well. So this is just sort of our first incarnation of the goddess of love and war. So let's look at this vase. It's pretty tall. It's about a yard tall. It is open, so it was a vessel that could have held an offering, could have held grains, could have held oils. And it's decorated with several bands of carvings. And we're going to look at these. They're called registers. So we have many registers, and we're going to examine these closely. This was carved from alabaster, so it is a hard stone, and that's why it has survived. It was not made of clay or mud, but something a little harder, and probably protected eventually, like buried, so archaeologists could find it. So I have several slides we're going to look at in detail. So here's the entire vase over here. We're going to look at the very bottom register, and I mean the very, very bottom, and you can see the wavy line across there that undoubtedly represents water. Water is life. You've already learned about the significance of those two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, and how that was what anchored the civilizations in this spot. So water. The next register shows plant life, and I love these plants. You can see that they are not really rigidly symmetrical, but there's a sense of organicism about them. They kind of look like corn plants to me with these big leaves like corn. So you can see stalks, you can see leaves, and up on the very top you can see the grain heads up there, and the little kernels, the individual kernels are also visible. So it's beautiful. It's a beautiful pattern of these plants growing. The next register shows their domesticated animals, probably sheep or goats, and you can see some horns on these animals. So that was another key thing. They had their herds, and they were meat eaters, and they milked and ate it, and they gained fertilizer from the keeping of animals as well. Then we have a blank register followed by a register full of humans. So this is your very first representation of humans in this class. Humans that really undoubtedly did not look a whole lot different from us. And none of them do, but we're going to see how differently they're all represented, which I think is interesting. So this shows a group of humans all parading with their feet apart. They're striding, and they're parading to the left. And they're all carrying something, and they're all nude, and they're all male. So there's many similarities. There's a pattern here of nude males carrying objects. The objects they are carrying appear to be offerings, which is, appropriate for an offering vase. This man here is carrying a jug, probably a jug of wine or possibly oil, although it's very big. This man, it could be a harp or a bow. This man seems to have a bowl. This looks like a basket that is brimming over with something. Now look at their bodies. It's kind of hard to see it, but I've told you that they're nude. They're shown in profile, but in addition to that, these are not mere symbols for people, but there's a lot of attention to details on their body. For example, look around the knees and at the hips. So we see some articulation of muscles, of joints. Very interesting. And their heads in profile. The eye is frontal. I'll show you another eye in a second. But yeah, they're all in profile. Now the proportions of their bodies are not actually accurate, and that's okay. We're going to forgive them for that. We're going to see some better proportioned humans. So here's the very top register of this vase, and here's the goddess Inanna, the person they're bringing all this to. So you can see she must be very, very special. Inanna is not nude. She is clothed in a long wraparound dress. She's also shown in profile, but her body kind of looks frontal, but not her feet. And she's got some kind of headdress, some retainers back here. And the man in the forefront of this assembly of people bringing offerings is holding another big basket that is brimming over with stuff. Here you can clearly see his face and his eye, which is not a profile eye. It's kind of difficult to see Inanna's eye, but it looks like it's drawn quite differently than the man's eye. She might even have a profile eye. Very difficult to see. Okay, so that's the Inanna vase that would have been brought to honor the goddess Inanna. But every temple would have had figures like these in them. These are called votive figures. They would have brought the petitions of individuals to the attention of the deity in the temple. So first of all, it's a group. There's men and women here. There's a lot of variety. But the things that they have in common is they're all standing with their weight evenly balanced on 2 feet. They're all staring forward with enlarged eyes, and they're clasping their hands in front of their chest, which must be interpreted as a sign of petitioning or praying to the deity. Now, the differences. First of all, you notice the sizes, and these don't represent ages of humans, but rather probably the income level of the person who placed them. So that very tall man probably cost more in the marketplace than this little man. So I think that's kind of interesting. But I like to look at other things. I like to look at the details of their costume and their hair. So look at all the men, for example. The men have long beards and long hair. And not only is it long, but it's dressed. Somebody has carefully combed that and curled that so that the beard and the hair are all in neat little curly rows. So it's very fun to see that. The women, in contrast, don't seem to pay much attention to their hair. It's just kind of pulled back or very short. So there's a woman, this woman here seems to be bald, and another woman over here, nothing special. The men's clothing all seems to be long skirts that have a very long fringe on them. So they may look slightly different lengths, but that's one thing they have in common. The women are wearing a simpler garment that wraps, except for this woman right here. The bald woman is wearing a fringe skirt like the man. So these are votive figures. Let's look at a couple close-ups. So here is a color picture, and their eyes were painted on. The beard is painted on. All of these to make them look realistic. Yes, kind of, sort of. So we have a man and a woman here wearing the fringe skirt and the wrap garment. And notice beside the woman, like down by her feet, there's a little stump there. And if you look closely at that, that little stump is actually two little calves, two little leg parts, and a pair of little tiny feet. So that tells me that at some point there was a child standing beside the woman, and somehow in the 5,000 years since they were made, she's been lost. But I think that's very interesting. Now, something else interesting from Sumerian culture is this, and it's a reconstructed harp that was placed in a tomb. So, before we start digging at the piece itself, the context is very important because anytime you have grave goods, that indicates that there's a belief in an afterlife because these things were valuable and you wouldn't bury it, you wouldn't get rid of it if you didn't think that the owner needed it or wanted it in the afterlife and would appreciate having it. So grave goods exist where there's that belief in an afterlife where stuff will come in handy. So this has been reconstructed. The wood is not 5,000 years old. It is new wood, but the gold and the lapis and the decorative parts are old. So we're going to look at those. So just regard this beautiful bullhead with this amazing blue beard of lapis lazuli. Um, the stone, the blue stone, had to be imported from Afghanistan. Let's look at the decorations on the front panel. So this is what I think is most interesting. I mean, I love lapis lazuli, but these little pictures are so fun. So there's 4 frames here with 4 separate vignettes um, showing some very interesting scenes. We see animals behaving like humans, animals doing weird things. We see some hybrid creatures. So let's look from the top down. There's a man um, in between 2 bull type animals. Their heads are very similar to this bull on the front of the harp with that very long decorative beard. The next panel down shows a dog-like creature, possibly a jackal, and a lion, and they are carrying a table of food and a jug of wine and a cup, probably to a feast. So this is 2 animals behaving like humans, and they're even walking on their hind feet. The third frame down shows 2 animals playing a harp, just like this harp. So there's an animal on the left pulling at the strings, which I'm sorry you can't see, but they would have been new strings anyway. And a bear type animal, I don't know, doing something over here. And here's the bull's head on the front of that harp, so you can see that it is indeed like the very harp this is on. And then the bottom one compares this man who's standing there with a scorpion tail um, to the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I know some of you have read because every time I give this lecture in a live class, I say, who's read the Epic of Gilgamesh? And several hands come up. So there's that man and another animal acting like a human here. So what we have here is a fabulous snapshot of Sumerian culture. It shows us that they have visual arts, they have literature, and they have music. And I'm saying literature because I'm sure, I'm very confident that all these pictures represent something from a story or a tale or a poem that was part of their culture because they seem very specific and they would have been known by any viewer. I'd also like to compare the animals acting like humans to some Greek stories that have come down to us called Aesop's fables. So if you're familiar with any of those, you know that was a device that Aesop used in his storytelling, was making his animals behave like humans in order to teach the real humans important lessons. Some more Sumerian stuff, and this is a cylinder seal. This is one way that they would sign their name to important documents. It identified property ownership. So a man's name, or I say a man, but I suppose it could have been a woman as well, would be created in some sort of symbolic uh, mode using these figures and carved into a cylinder of some hard material. In this case, it's lapis, but they're not all lapis. And then when you wanted to sign your name to something, you would roll that. There's a hole down the middle, so you could put a stick through there and then roll it over a piece of clay, and this is the impression you would get, which would be your name. So I think you should be able to see in this impression several people in long fringed skirts doing a bunch of different things, playing a harp, sitting on a chair. There's a table here with food on it, another person sitting on a chair, and over here a chair. So even though I can't interpret it, but it's definitely interpretable, and you can see the images. Another small piece of Sumerian art is this called the Standard of Ur, and it's not terribly long, just 19 inches, but each side, and there's two sides to it. It's from a box, and there's three registers on the top, three registers down here, and the second one. These registers all illustrate war. So the theme is war, and you can tell in the middle register that there's an army, a bunch of men, all identical, lined up. The bottom register there shows war chariots and horses, and they're ready to go off. At the very top register, we've got probably the army leadership. Down below in the peace one, you can see the things that people do when they're not fighting. So there's a lot of agriculture shown here. There's livestock, there's a handling of crops, people sitting and probably talking or maybe having a feast. But that's just kind of more Sumerian imagery. Now we're going to move on. So I told you that people invaded this desirable area of Mesopotamia, and we have many subsequent cultures. You don't have to worry about those. I just organize it in this way so that maybe you can see some changes. I hope you can see some changes over time, but just think of them as the ancient Near East or Mesopotamia. So our next culture that comes in is a group called the Akkadians, and they invaded from the north. They came into the Sumerian territory and were so in awe of what they saw there that they sort of adopted it. They didn't destroy the temples on the ziggurats, they just sort of took them over, and they said, hey, ziggurats with temples on top, this is pretty awesome. And the writing, they learned how to write, so the writing became their own. I mean, it was just like they had culture envy, and they finally just took it over. So the Akkadian leader that invaded was named Sargon the First, and his invasion happened in 2332 BCE. Also, in case you haven't figured it out, you do not need to know dates. I just tell you them so that you can get a sense of the flow of history. Here's a new twist. When Sargon the First came in, he declared himself a god. So probably the first time that we're going to look at a culture where a human says, no, I'm not a human. I'm actually divine. So he did that. This piece that we're looking at was created by his grandson, who was also the ruler of the Akkadian Empire. And his name is Naram Sin. So this is Naram Sin here, and we're going to look at this. It's a stele of Naram Sin. I think it's our only Akkadian piece. So we're going to take a deep dive on it. You can tell by this, the carving on this stone, that it's relief carving, meaning it's not in the round. And up in the sky, there are three things that look kind of like daisies. Those are thought to be gods, representatives of gods. There's a lot of men down in the bottom, and there's a mountain here. And then we have one man that stands alone, sort of isolated against the sky, and that's our hero, Naram Sin. So we're going to zoom in, as I said, but let's look at this, the big picture first. So all these humans at the bottom, or most of these humans, are Naram Sin's army. And then we have some representations of the defeated enemy. I don't know who was fighting at this time, but he's killing somebody. So there's two enemy here, and there's some dead bodies sort of hanging down here. So that's our organization. Now, we're going to zoom in and get a look at Naram Sin and his soldiers. So let's look at his mode of depiction first of all. I think the little men walking around the Inanna vase were all in profile. And Naram Sin is not. He's in profile from the bottom of his feet up to his waist, so his legs are in profile, his feet, his knees. But then from his waist to his neck, he's frontal. He's shown frontally with his arms coming out on either side. Then his head is shown in profile, and you can tell that by seeing his ear over here. Whereas if he were frontal, he'd have one ear on each side on the edge of his head. His helmet is shown frontally because it has two horns on it, also an indication of divinity. Now, compare his size to these other figures. These the enemies, remember, and these figures down here are his army. He's bigger than everybody, but there's three different scales. Naram Sin is the largest. Then under him is his army, and the smallest of all these creatures are the enemy. This is called hierarchic scale, and it is used to show who's the most important person here, to show this ranking, this hierarchy in the culture. So it's used as a device in artwork. So if you were walking along wherever this stele was placed and you saw this and you were unable to read the inscription, you would not need to read anything to realize that this guy right there is the most important person here. In fact, you could pretty much tell what was going on without reading. This mountain is just a blank slate for all of the cuneiform writing that tells us his name and what was going on and who the enemy are. Now look at the enemy figures, because we have dead bodies here. They've already been killed by the victorious Naram Sin. We have this man right here who's down on the ground, who's taken a spear through his neck. He's on his way out. And this man over here behind him who seems to be pleading for his life. Please don't kill me. Interesting. Now look at the bodies. Look at the way that they've been carved. There's still a lot of attention to detail of body musculature, even on the enemies. I mean, look at his muscles on this upper arm. So to me, these artists are very talented, and the fact that this was made so long ago and still has this detail that we can see today is pretty amazing. So, over 4,000 years old. So that's it. This is now our next ziggurat. This is the Namazugarati at Ur. This was built about 1,000 years after the first one that we saw that was just a pile of dirt. This one was dedicated to Nana, the moon god. It was planned to be really super high. The base measures 190 by 130 feet. And there are 3 different stairways, as you can see, leading up to the gate. I think it was restored. I think it was rebuilt. This is in modern day Iraq, and I think that the Iraqi government must have restored this. But they did not restore the temple. As you can see, there's no temple up there. Now notice this human over here standing on the parapet or the edge, and that gives you a sense of scale of the whole thing. Sumerian culture revived. That was another Sumerian ziggurat there. Um, and when the Akkadian culture fell, the city of Girsu remained independent of the invading power of the Guti, which we're not even going to talk about the Guti. And the Sumerians regained power. The leader, their secular leader, meaning he's not a priest and he doesn't claim to be a god, the secular ruler is Gudea. He restored temples and he placed votive statues of himself in the temples. This reflects a return to the modest roles of the non-divine ruler. So we're going to look at Gudea because I'm sure as soon as his picture came up, you were amused or shocked at how different he looks, especially from that huge muscular hero of Naram Sin. So Gudea, first of all, looks very childlike, and this is because of the proportions of his body, that his head seems to be too large for his body. These are not adult proportions, but they are childlike proportions. And he's also beardless, and he doesn't have long hair. So all these characteristics we saw applied to men are not applied to him. He's always wears this little cap with this very large brim. It's almost like a little helmet cap. So let's look at him. So I pointed out he's beardless. He's also got really broad shoulders. This figure of him, he's carrying a vase, and the vase is spewing out 2 streams of water, signifying how important and central to life water is. So water is life. And the inscription that tells us how he had restored the temples or whatever is all carved on his skirt. So it will always be attached to this monument. More figures of Gudea here. So you can see when I say that's the way he always looks. It wasn't just an aberration, that first one, but he always appears childlike. And he always is beardless, and he always wears that little cap. So here's some more Gudeas. And this is a particularly good Gudea. Look how squatty this figure is. And the writing on his skirt is very clear. So here's a couple of concepts that we just covered in our very first lecture. And one is scale. So we saw hierarchic scale with Naram Sin. We saw how the important person is made larger, and we will continue to see this through many cultures and many artworks. So remember that. And then with little Gudea, we saw that the proportions within his person are not adult proportions. Like there's certain ratios or canons of proportions that he's not abiding by. And just to help me make this point really clear, I'm using some Disney characters. So the scale of Mickey and Pluto is wacky. It's way off. Mickey is a mouse. He should be tiny, down maybe the size of Pluto's paw, but instead he's shown kind of towering over Pluto. And obviously, the proportion of Pinocchio's nose is not quite right. But that was a plot point in the story. So that's, thank you, Disney. That's the end of your first part of Chapter 2. Stay tuned for Part 2.